Howdy, partners. Welcome to Saddle and Sixskin. Are you drawn to tales of grit, survival, and the untamed spirit of the Old West? Then you've come to the right place. Here at Saddle and Sixskin, we're passionate about bringing you stories that resonate with the heart, stories that explore the raw humanity that thrived in the face of adversity. Now, before we get into the story, if you like what you hear, why don't you give Saddle and Sixskin a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel? It helps us keep bringing you these tales from the American frontier. Today, we're venturing into the heart of 1878 Arizona, a land as beautiful as it is brutal. Imagine a father's desperate cry echoing across the crimson cliffs. Nakai is his name, a Comanche warrior clutching his infant son as the very earth beneath him crumbles and betrays them both. He found himself in Red Canyon after the death of his wife, the baby's white mother, in a raid on their wagon train. But then a shadowed young woman, her face etched with unspoken grief, defies a town's venomous silence and offers an unyielding hand. Meet Eliza Hart, a woman haunted by her own past losses, whose one act of defiance will shatter prejudices and forge an unbreakable bond in the unforgiving Red Canyon. What price will courage demand in this unforgiving land? And will redemption bloom from the dust? The sun clawed its way over the jagged red spires of Arizona Territory in 1878, baking Red Canyon into a furnace of rust-colored stone and relentless dust. The wind howled through the narrow gulch like a coyote's warning, whipping alkali grit into the eyes of anyone foolish enough to linger on the main drag. This was no welcoming outpost, it was a scar on the desert's hide, perched precariously where sheer cliffs dropped into abyssal shadows. And every shadow held a grudge. Now, if you think that this story sounds interesting, then like the page and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. We have a lot of exciting stories of the West to tell. Folks here scratched out a living from stubborn scrub and silver claims, but their real trade was suspicion, traded like bullets in the saloon, loaded with the ghosts of Apache raids and settler massacres. Into this viper's nest rode Nakai, his bay mare picking a deliberate path down the sun-blasted street. He was a Comanche carved from the Badlands themselves, broad shoulders wrapped in a frayed wool serape, face etched with the fine lines of sun and sorrow, eyes like polished obsidian under a sweat-brimmed hat. Cradled against his chest in a cradle board of supple deerskin was his son, scarcely 3 moons old, swaddled tight against the world's indifference. Now, before we continue our journey, tell us, where are you tuning in from? And what draws you to stories of raw humanity? Your shares light the way. So, if you like what you've heard so far, give us a like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. The infant stirred, a faint murmur escaping like steam from a cooling iron. Nakai's wife, pale-skinned Eliza from some forgotten Missouri farm, who'd chosen his world over her own, lay buried in a nameless arroyo, gutted by raiders on the migrant trail. Her last breath had been a rattle of regret, keep him breathing, Nakai, for us. Now he rode for water, work, anything to outrun the hollow in his gut. The townsfolk froze mid-stride as he passed. A prospector spat tobacco juice into the dust, missing his spittoon by a mile. Look sharp, boys. Trouble's come, he muttered, voice gravel-dry as the creek bed. Women clutched shawls tighter, hurrying children behind calico skirts, while men at the mercantile leaned on wagon tongues, thumbs hooked in belt loops studded with .45s. Whispers slithered like sidewinders, half-breed bastard. Mark him. Bringing his savage stink to civilized territory. Ought to run him out before he calls down the whole damn nation. No one offered a nod, a canteen, a shadowed porch. The liveryman barred his gate with a glare. The boarding house landlady crossed her arms over her flour-dusted apron, lips pursed like a loaded shotgun. Nakai's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Words were wind here, and wind betrayed no one. From the shadowed mouth of the livery, half hidden by stacked hay bales and the stink of horse sweat, Eliza Hart watched it all unfold. 19 and wiry as a mesquite switch, she wore a faded brown vest over a black and white calico dress hitched for riding, her wide-brimmed Stetson shading eyes the color of storm clouds over the rincon. Her hands, calloused from curry combs and cinches, gripped a pitchfork like a lance. Orphaned young, she'd seen her father, big-hearted Jed Hart, the canyon's best friar, swept away in a flash flood 5 years back. The waters had roared down the dry wash like a Comanche war party, dragging him under while the town gawked from high ground, too yellow-bellied to toss a line. One rope, Eliza had whispered that night, alone in the adobe with the rain drumming like accusations. One goddamn rope and he'd be here now. Branded a fool for her solitude, she mucked stalls and mended tack, her silence a shield against the town's pitying sneers. But as Nakai's mare passed, the baby's cry pierced her like a barbed quirt. Something stirred in her chest, a flicker of that old fury, the what-ifs that gnawed like thirst. She straightened, fork forgotten, and met his gaze for a beat too long. He nodded once, faint as a mirage, before vanishing into the heat haze toward the canyon trail. The desert held its breath, waiting for the spark. By noon, the canyon's throat tightened under a sky like hammered tin, the air thick with the tang of creosote and unspoken reckonings. Nakai reined his mare toward the ragged caravan assembling at the trailhead, a sorry string of freighters and pilgrims bound for the seep where the cliffs wept brackish tears into a tanaja. Water was the town's lifeblood, hoarded like silver dust, and no lone rider claimed it without eyes on his back. He tied off the horse to a wind-gnarled juniper, the cradle board slung across his chest like a talisman. The babe's whimpers sharpened into cries that clawed at the dry hush. Folks gave him a berth wider than a rattlesnake's coil. A teamster with a salt-crusted beard yanked his mule train aside, muttering curses under his breath, while a sunbonnet matron shielded her brood, hissing, "Keep clear, you hear? That one's got patchy eyes, mark me." Tales of raids hung heavy as guns, scalps taken at dawn, wagons gutted like fish bellies, fueling the fear that any dark-skinned drifter might light the next fuse. Nakai ignored the barbs, his focus narrowing to the narrow defile ahead, a goat path etched into the rust-veined wall where footing turned treacherous and wind keened through fissures like a banshee's dirge. He fell in behind a dust-caked chuck wagon, the driver's squint lingering on the cradle board as if weighing its worth against the powder in his flask. The group shuffled forward in a ragged line, boots grinding shale to powder, the canyon amplifying every scrape and snort into a chorus of unease. Overhead, a hawk wheeled in lazy circles, its shadow slithering over the throng like fate's own surveyor. Nakai shifted the babe higher, murmuring low Comanche syllables, words for rain and roots, for holding fast against the storm. His free hand brushed the knife hilt at his belt, worn smooth as a worry stone. The infant quieted for a spell, lulled by the rhythm, but the air grew heavier, charged with the ozone bite of distant thunderheads miraging on the horizon. From her vantage at the livery's hitch rail, Eliza watched the procession snake into the gorge, her pitchfork idle against a post. The encounter on the drag still burned in her veins like cheap whiskey, a nod exchanged across yards of baked earth, heavy with the weight of strangers recognizing mirrors in each other's scars. She slung a feed sack over her shoulder, but her steps veered toward the trail's mouth, drawn by that pull she couldn't name, the same itch that had her replaying flood nights and fevered dreams. Dust devils spun lazy waltzes in her wake, and as she crested the rise, a low tremor rippled underfoot. Not thunder, but the earth itself groaning as if the canyon's bones ached from old fractures. The wind picked up, gusting sharply and suddenly, carrying snatches of the babe's wail like a harbinger. Eliza's grip tightened on the sack, her pulse sinking to the uneasy cadence of hooves ahead. Something was uncoiling in the red rock's belly, and she felt it in her marrow, a warning etched in the land's unforgiving script. That's the halfway point of the story. So, if you've enjoyed this story of the Old West, like Saddle and Sixkin and subscribe. This helps to keep our community growing. Then it came, a savage shudder that ripped through the canyon floor like a Comanche lance through hide, the red rock splintering under the caravan's weight. Shale erupted in a choking plume, the trail buckling as if the devil himself had hooked the earth and yanked. Screams fractured the air, mules bucking wild against traces, the chuck wagon tilting into a yawning crevasse that clawed open like a fresh grave. Nakai's mare reared, forelegs pawing sky, but he was already airborne, the cradle board slamming against his ribs as the ledge gave way beneath them. Time stretched thin as buckskin. He twisted mid-fall, one arm flailing for purchase on a jagged outcrop, the other clamped vice-tight around the babe. They plummeted 10 feet, then snagged hard, his fingers gouging into a gnarled mesquite root protruding from the sheer face, the branch creaking like a hangman's noose under their combined pull. Below stretched 200 feet of unforgiving void, a fang-toothed ravine where vultures rode thermals on sun-bleached bones. The infant's wail pierced the din, raw and relentless, a tiny thunder rolling off the walls. Up top, the caravan dissolved into pandemonium. A freighter clawed backward on all fours, his hat tumbling into the abyss. The matron clutched her skirts, face ashen as canyon dust, barking prayers to a god who'd long since turned deaf. "Let the Comanche drop, save the white folk first," bellowed the teamster, his voice cracking like dry timber, echoed by a chorus of half-hearted jeers from those too gut-shot to move. A few edged forward, peering into the maw, boots scraping rimstone, hands hovering useless as they weighed the risk against the stranger's skin, but fear rooted them like creosote and cacti. No one uncoiled a lariat, no one barked orders. The wind howled mockery through the fissures, gusting up the gorge in hot, sulphurous breaths that stung eyes and choked throats. Nakai dangled there, muscles burning like branding irons, the root fibers fraying under the strain, his son's cries sinking to the frantic tattoo of his own pulse. Sweat carved rivulets through the grime on his face, dripping into the gulf below. "Hold, little warrior," he growled through gritted teeth, Comanche grit fueling the burn in his grip. But the branch groaned again, splintering audibly, and the babe's wail pitched higher, a siren's call that clawed at the marrow of anyone with half a soul left. That's when Eliza exploded into motion, her feed sack hitting the dust like a spent cartridge as she sprinted the last yards to the brink. The tremor had flung her to her knees back at the rise, but she'd scrambled up with a friar's curse, that old flood rage igniting like phosphorus on tinder. No time for second guesses. She yanked the coiled lariat from her saddle bag, 50 feet of sun-bleached hemp soft as sin from years of faithful knots, and drove the iron stake deep into fractured quartz with a hammer blow from her boot heel. Wind clawed at her Stetson, but she lashed the rope's tail around her waist in a bowline that wouldn't betray, the knot biting into her vest like a promise. "You, boy in the red shirt," she snapped at a gawking lad no older than 14, frozen mid-sob near the wagon tongue. His eyes bulged like a spooked colt's, but she seized his collar, thrusting the free end into his trembling fists. "Grip it like your ma's apron, and don't you dare slack. Pull when I say." He nodded, mute as stone, anchoring low, while two more men, shamed into action by her glare, braced his shoulders. Eliza dropped to her belly, the rim's edge gnawing at her ribs through calico and leather, and fed the rope hand over hand into the chasm. Pebbles skittered from under her elbows, pattering down like scattershot into the depths. The drop yawned below, a throat of shadow and sharp-toothed boulders, the mesquite branch swaying like a drunkard's gallows 30 feet down. Nakai's face tilted up, hawk-sharp and slick with effort, locking onto hers through the haze. She could see the strain etching deeper lines around his obsidian eyes, the cradle board's fringe fluttering like war banners in the updraft. "Easy now, loop it around your wrist," she called, voice steady as a gunsmith's hammer, though her heart hammered like a stampede. He shifted one-handed, the babe's cries muffled against his chest, and snagged the rope, his calloused palm closing over it like a trap springing shut. Inch by blood-slick inch, she paid out line, her boots braced against the stake, the boy and his anchors grunting as the weight bit in. Now, if tales like this, where one raw nerve of grit turns the tide on a whole damn canyon, pull you in like a dust devil, do me a solid and subscribe to the channel. We're all drifters in this wild narrative, and your support keeps the stories flowing true. Now back to the brink. The wind shrieked fiercer, whipping her skirts into a frenzy and sending a loose chunk of rimrock tumbling past them, exploding on the talus below in a puff of red powder. Eliza's palms shredded on the hemp spike, warm trickles tracing her wrists, but she leaned out farther, feeding rope until Nakai could haul himself upward, the babe secured in the curve of his arm like a loaded Winchester. The branch splintered with a crack like a thunderclap, roots tearing free in a shower of dirt, but he was clear, swinging free on the line, boots scraping the sheer face for purchase. Pull! Eliza roared, and the makeshift crew heaved as one, sinews straining, faces purpling under the canyon's merciless glare. Nakai ascended in fits and starts, the rope singing under the load, until his free hand crested the lip. Rough fingers, scarred from rains and raids, clutched the rimstone, and with a final, guttural heave, he vaulted over, collapsing in a heap of dust and deerskin, the infant's wail cutting off into hiccuping gasps of safety. The crowd exhaled as one ragged breath, the jeers dying unborn on their lips, but Eliza didn't linger for thanks. She uncoiled the rope from her waist, palms stinging like bee stings, and rose unsteadily, the gorge's echo still ringing in her ears. Dust settled like a shroud over the canyon rim, the aftershocks fading into a brittle silence broken only by the infant's hiccuping sobs and the ragged symphony of heaving chests. Nakai rolled to his knees, deerskin cradle board pressed to his breast like a shield, his free hand, raw and lacerated, brushing the boy's downy cheek to still the tremors. The child latched onto his thumb, quieting to soft gurgles, oblivious to the precipice that had nearly claimed them both. Around them, the caravan's remnants stirred uneasily. The teamsters' jeers curdled into coughs, the matron's prayers trailed off into averted eyes, and the boy in the red shirt released the rope with hands blanched white-knuckled, but all gazes funneled to Eliza, who pushed up from the gravel on scraped forearms, her steps askew, calico torn at the hem where rock teeth had nipped, blood flecked her palms like rust on iron filings, yet she met their stares square, chin lifted against the wind's lingering bite. Nakai rose slowly, as a man surfacing from deep water, his obsidian eyes locking on hers, not with the weary squint of a drifter, but the unyielding gratitude of kin forged in fire. He knelt then, one knee grinding into the shale, the babe cradled secure, as he inclined his head low, voice emerging gravel rough from a throat parched by dust and dread. No soul in this scorched hell saves a Comanche, save you. The words hung blunt as a bow knife's edge, slicing through the hush. Eliza wiped her hands on her vest, the sting sharpening her focus, and crouched to his level, her storm-gray eyes unflinching. I didn't save a Comanche, she said, low and level as a rifle's bore, the canyon walls drinking in the truth. I saved a father and his boy. Skins got no say in that tally. The declaration landed like a spent shell casing, rolling into the collective gut of the onlookers. The teamster shifted his boots, scuffing a divot in the talus. The matron's shawl slipped from her fingers, forgotten. No retorts rose, only the wind's low moan, carrying the echo like smoke from a signal fire. Nakai straightened, the lines of his face easing fractionally, a ghost of a nod passing between them like a sealed pact. He adjusted the cradle board straps with deliberate care, then turned toward his mare, who whinnied softly from the tree line, flanks lathered, but legs sound. The group dispersed in fits, wagons righted with curses, mules coaxed back to traces, but the air hummed with a new charge, heavier than before the fall. By dusk, the tail galloped ahead of the survivors like a mustang with the bit in its teeth, twisting through Red Canyon's veins faster than rotgut in a miner's flask. Saloon doors swung on whispers, girl from the livery, heartsick, yanked a redskin and his whelp from the devil's own jaws. The mercantile buzzed with half-truths over bolts of gingham, the landlady's boarding house crackled with forks, pausing mid-scrape on tin plates. Factions splintered sharp as canyon glass. Grizzled claim jumpers at the long bar slammed fists on scarred oak, foaming about, Fool Mercy inviting Apache knives to supper, their spittle-flecking wanted posters yellowed by sun. She'll curse us all. Mark my words, that breeds bad juju. And now he's in our debt, like a snake in the henhouse. Outside in shadowed doorways and under lantern glow, quieter voices murmured counterpoint. The freighter who'd braced the boy, nursing a split lip from the scramble, allowing to his partner over coffee grounds, reckon she shamed us proper? Man's a man when the rock gives way, bloodline be damned. A seamstress, fingers pricked from hasty hems, confided to her neighbor across the picket fence, saw it clear as day, girl with more sand than the whole damn council combined. The divide carved the town like a dry wash after a flash flood. One side hunkered in bunkhouses, nursing grudges with whiskey and Winchester rounds, the other, a smattering of souls, pilgrims perhaps, or those worn thin by their own ghosts, nursed a grudging awe, eyes flicking toward the livery where Eliza had vanished to tend her cuts with carbolic and cloth. Night clamped down hard, stars punching holes in the black vault overhead, while coyotes yipped challenges from the rimrock. Nakai bedded down in a shallow alcove off the main drag, his fire a miserly flicker of mesquite twists, the babe nursing at a skin of goat's milk procured from a reluctant vendor. Eliza forked hay in the dim stable light, bandaged palms rough, the scent of liniment mingling with horse musk. But sleep dodged them both, the day's raw edge lingering like powder burns, a fracture in the town's brittle crust, waiting for the next tremor to widen. Dawn cracked the eastern rim like a .44 splitting a walnut, painting red canyon spires in blood-orange fire, the chill night air yielding to a heat that promised another scorcher. In the town's sun-bleached square, where the gallows scaffold doubled as a bandstand for 4th of July hoedowns, a crowd milled uneasily as spooked longhorns, hat brims low, spurs jingling faintly against the gravel. Word had spread like pox through the bunkhouses. Captain Harlan Reed, the iron-fisted ex-cavalry bullhacker who'd carved his spread from a patch of hellish badlands, was holding forth from the porch of the assay office, his scarred cheek twitching under a salt-and-pepper mustache. Reed was no tenderfoot preacher. He'd lost half his company to arrows at adobe walls and still rode with a brace of Navy Colts, but his word carried weight heavier than a miner's poke. Fair dealings with mescaleros during the '72 uprising had bought him grudging respect from red and white alike. Now, flanked by his ramrod and a pair of vaqueros in silver conchoed chaps, he scanned the throng with eyes like chipped flint. The assembly hushed as a held breath before the hammer falls. Nakai stood at the fringe, babe slung secure in the cradle board, his serape dusted with the night's frost, one hand resting light on the knife sheath, like a man testing the wind's temper. Eliza lingered nearby, bandaged palms tucked in her vest pockets, her Stetson tugged low against the glare, drawn by the murmur that Reed's gaze had lingered on the livery at first light. The captain cleared his throat, gravel scraping tin, and the square went dead still, save for a distant anvil clang. Heard about the dust up on the rim yesterday, he rumbled, voice carrying clean to the back row like a bugle call. Girl with rope and grit hauling a Comanche and his young un from the devil's pantry while the rest of us stood gawking like greenhorns at a stampede. Murmurs rippled, grunts of agreement from the freighters, scowls from the saloon toughs, but Reed rode them down with a raised palm, scarred from saber cuts. Life in this godforsaken territory ain't tinted by skin or scalp lock, it's forged in gut and grace that holds the line when the rock crumbles or the arrow flies. That breed, Nakai, ain't it? He dangled like bait on a trot line, and she fished him free. Man's earned his breath, same as any who'd stake a claim here. The square shifted, boots scraping like whispers of concession. The teamster from the trail ducking his head, while the matron fiddled with her bonnet strings. Reed's gaze pinned Nakai directly, unblinking as a hawk's stoop. Heard tell you're handy with horseflesh, broke mustangs on the Llano, track better than any scout from Fort Bowie. My remuda's short a wrangler since that bronc pitched Jedediah into the Rio last moon, and my patrols need eyes that see through mirage and midnight. Nakai met the stare steadily, the babe stirring with a soft grunt against his chest. I ride straight, Captain. Horses heed me, and I know the washes where water hides and hostels hold up, but debts like yesterday's ain't paid with words. Reed barked a laugh, dry as mesquite bark. Nor with pride neither. Take the billet, oversee the string, scout the fence lines. Cabin by the springs is yours, adobe thick enough to fox winter winds, with a corral for that colt of yours. Boyle have milk cows and shade aplenty. A beat hung, then Nakai nodded once, sharp as a knife snap. I'll ride at dawn to see the lay. Reed turned to Eliza then, his flint eyes softening a hair's breadth. And you, Miss Hart, folks say you sling tack like a friarborn, but I have a parcel of ranch kids need ciphering and letters, their paws too stove up from stampedes to teach. My spread schoolhouse wants a hand, pay in script and supper, room in the bunkhouse annex. Town's got its fill of whispers out there, it's deeds that count. Eliza's jaw worked, the old flood scar tightening in her chest, but she squared up, voice level as a spirit level. Reckon I can chalk sums and spell out brands, if the young uns don't mind a teacher with rope burns. The crowd exhaled, a few nods breaking through the crust, the seamstress clapping softly, the boy in red flashing a gap-toothed grin. A weight ground by like a millstone, the square's fracture healing crooked but sure, grudges aired over flapjacks at the hash house evolving into weary yarns swapped at the forge. Come departure morn, a ragged line formed outside the livery, not the full town, but enough to choke a man up, the landlady thrusting a burlap sack of jerked venison and hardtack. The freighter palming Nakai a whetstone, gruff as gravel, even the teamster, nursing a black eye from saloon regrets, offering a twist of tobacco with a mumble about, no hard feelings. Eliza stood shoulder to shoulder with Nakai as the babe slumbered in the cradle board, tiny fists balled like frontier forts, the sun gilding the adobe walls in promise. In that taut pull of hemp days back, she'd snagged more than lives, yanked loose the knot of her own drowned ghosts, reclaiming the tether of trust in a land that chewed the careless. Nakai swung into the saddle, Reed's viceroys flanking like honor guards, the dust plume rising slowly as they wheeled toward the ranch trail. Red Canyon watched them go, the wind carrying faint yips of coyote approval from the rims, its whispers turning from venom to the low rasp of reluctant kinship, a frontier reforged, one raw nerve at a time. The canyon's echoes fade, but the grit of Red Canyon lingers, where one rope bridged chasms of fear and blood. So, what stirs in you from Eliza's stand, or Nakai's unyielding hold? Drop your thoughts below, your words fuel these frontier fires. And before we ride off into the sunset, make sure to like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. We're grateful for riding this trail with you until the next dust devil calls. Thanks for watching.